compensation payments for trip and slip claims cost Greater Manchester taxpayers almost £7.5 million last year. Salford spent £1.78 million on compensation, the equivalent of a council tax increase of nearly 2%. Oldham and Stockport councils also paid out more than £1 million. Michael Hardacre is a personal injury lawyer for legal firm Pannoni. Michael, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us this afternoon. We all kind of jokingly say, oh, where there's a blame, there's a claim. But is it this kind of compensation culture that we've got into now? Is that what's at fault here?
I don't think so, Natalie. The background is that the media portrays a certain situation, which is, as you said, sort of succinctly compensation culture. The reality is very different, and particularly in respect of trip and slip claims, if you can sort of call them that. The reality is now that if a case goes to court that is in any way fraudulent or exaggerated, there's every chance that a judge will see that immediately. There's never been, and this is another myth, there's never been any incentive for a lawyer like myself to take on a claim which you don't believe has a reasonable chance of succeeding, because if you do, the chances are you're going to lose, and if you lose, you're not going to get paid. Now, that may sound sort of a selfish way of approaching it, but it does underpin the fact that it's not as simple as saying people will go out there and make it up and get compensation for nothing, if you like. How
easy, then, or difficult is it to spot a fraudulent claim? I mean, without going into too many details, can you give us an example of where you've had a fraudulent claim?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of stories out there, but, I mean, if your client comes to you and says that they've fallen over a defective paving stone, for example, the first thing you would ask them is for photographs, because without photographs you can't prove that the paving stone was defective. And that leads us on to something else. The definition of what a court will decide is dangerous and blameworthy is, again, sort of wrapped up in mythology, because there are very clear, if you like, rules or guidelines that a court will apply. So it's not a case of a council is responsible for every defect in a pavement under every circumstance. What the council has to do is, if they've got enough, well, what they should be doing is applying the resources to make sure that they maintain the highways properly in the first place, to avoid getting into a situation where they end up having to pay out, because it's taking from one hand and giving with the other, because if the council spent the money up front to maintain the highways and the pavements, they wouldn't end up having to pay out so much at the back end, if you like, for compensation claims.
Now, those are big figures that we've been reading today, and people may look at them and think, oh, well, maybe I could get a kind of a big payout like that. And I know you say it's not the blame culture, but on average, are you getting a lot of these kind of claims coming into you that you're dealing with?
It's the opposite, Natalie. We get a lot less than we used to, because, in fact, the councils, generally speaking, are actually getting much better at making sure that they do maintain the highways. That's not applicable across the board, and what I think the figures, if you look at them today, do show is that, for example, while Salford Council may have paid out £1.78 million, Rochdale Council paid out £70,000 or something like that. Now, that to me suggests that Rochdale Council have got their act in order, and that they will be making sure that they have maintained the highways so that claims can't be justified, and they end up having to pay out much less in compensation. And I don't know the reality behind the figures, but at the other extreme, if Salford are paying out that much, I'd say there has to be a reason, and the reason is going to be that they aren't keeping the highways up to scratch.
Michael, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, though, for joining us this afternoon.